So I called this unraveling the vagus. As we know, the vagus is two nerves, really, a pair of nerves, exiting the cranium, originating in the brainstem, and a few nuclei back in the old part of our brain, really, and then exiting the cranium. And the reason why it's called the vagus is because it's from the same Latin root as vagrant, which means someone who wanders about all over the place. So it's like these nerves wander everywhere in the body. You know, they start coming down the neck and they go to your heart and your lungs and blah, 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 and then end up beneath your diaphragm and controlling most of your organs of digestion. So very long and complex nerves, mostly sensory, although some motor components as well. We'll look at that. But just to show you what what the nerve does, it does an awful lot, and certainly without it, we would be not able to function at all. So it regulates digestion, things like swallowing, the motility in the gut. It regulates heart rate and blood pressure. Regulates our breathing. It affects the lymphatic system. It's very much involved with reflex actions such as coughing, vomiting, sneezing, all those kind of stuff. And also very much involved with our immune system. And we'll talk a little bit about that, how it does that, and particularly inflammation. So it keeps an eye on inflammation in the body, particularly in the gut, and helps regulate that. Very much involved in gut health, and it has a very interesting kind of symbiotic relationship, which we'll touch on. And I want to touch on a lot of stuff today. We're going to have a lot of time. But so it has this kind of symbiotic relationship with our gut, and the gut microbiome. And I know there's a lot of interest in that. And it's a very, very interesting area to talk about. We could spend a whole hour just talking about that, really. But how the development of the vagus is stimulated actually in the baby through exposure to certain bacteria. And that is just a very, very interesting topic. So it's complex, and it's a key player in mood and anxiety disorders. So very much affected by our mood, but also affects our mood. So both ways, really. And I think one of the really interesting things to look at is what it's affected by, or what might interfere with the smooth operation of the vagus, the efficient operation of the vagus. And when you read a lot of books about the vagus, of which there are thousands, well, not thousands, but there are hundreds of them, a lot of those books tend to focus on one aspect. So they might focus on things like, well, how can we affect the vagus with the breath, with social interaction, with what we eat, etc. But really, when we're looking at with our clients, we have to look at kind of the big picture. So I'm very keen on this, to look at this from different angles. And so the first thing, as manual therapists, and this is really, really important, the vagus can get affected by what we would call nerve entrapment. Now, nerve entrapment, what does that mean? It doesn't mean that somehow a nerve is kind of squished between two vertebrae or something like this. And as I said, the vagus nerve is extremely long. And there are certain places in the body where it's more prone to nerve entrapment than other places. And there's certain places in the body where it's more superficial, where it can get more affected by things like operations, accidents, and things like this. So with any nerve, when we talk about nerve entrapment, we're talking about nerves that might get compressed, stretched, inflamed, etc. Sometimes the blood flow to that area is affected. So there are kind of classic places that, as manual therapists, we want to look at in terms of nerve entrapment. One of the places is where the vagus exits the cranium, sort of behind the ears here. It exits the cranium next to your jugular vein. And also there's a couple of other nerves that come through that little hole there. And so, issues like compression around this area, which we can see a lot happening in birth, for example, things like forceps and other kinds of deliveries, can really affect the vagus here as it exits the cranium. And then, of course, it travels down the neck, and there's lots of places around here, particularly where it comes under the clavicle, sort of just near the sternocleidomastoid muscle there, where it's prone to, entrapment. And when we talk about entrapment, you could also say that the way that the vagus nerve travels through the fascia, and if the fascia is congested, tight, dehydrated, blah, 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 that's going to affect capillary action, that's going to affect the operation of the vagus. So this is another area that we tend to look at here. And then it goes down through the body and goes through the diaphragm, which as we know is like tendon and muscle and fascia. And you can get all kinds of things going on in the diaphragm, which might affect the operation of the vagus. And in fact, one of the things that we teach in terms of breath work, you will have seen probably that one of the ways of stimulating the vagus is through abdominal kind of breathing, long out breaths, but this movement of the diaphragm is very important because it kind of stretches the vagus and stimulates the vagus through these long exhalations as it goes through next to the esophagus and comes through the diaphragm. So that's, there's lots to this. And as manual therapists, we can certainly affect issues around nerve entrapment. There was a question about the cervical area. So particularly, as we'll see, the vagus goes really close to the atlas, and particularly the axis, where it almost touches it there. So, if you've got issues around that, as many of our clients do, many people have issues in that top area here, that can affect the vagus there, around the axis and the atlas. So again, as manual therapists, we can address that. So viruses, and this has come out a lot with things like COVID. There's been a lot of, some studies around the vagus and long COVID, for example, recently, which is very exciting. It's not particularly conclusive, but it's clear that the vagus is definitely affected by viruses, like other nerves are. You get shingles, for example, which is a viral thing. Bacteria is another thing. I mean, we know this from Lyme's disease, which is a tick-borne thing, which is a bacterial infection, and that can have a devastating effect on the vagus sometimes and lead to all kinds of ME-type symptoms and all kinds of things like that. So we know that trauma can have a specific kind of effect, and we won't have time to go into it in a lot of detail today, but it can switch the vagus into sometimes unhelpful ways of operating. One thing I would like to say about the vagus and our autonomic nervous system in general is that it's completely designed to help us survive. And the evolution of the vagus, as we'll see, the way it's evolved through millennia, has been around survival. How do we survive? And I'll talk a bit about that. So when we're talking about trauma, we're talking about how it might be affected by traumatic events. And this is complicated because we don't necessarily know everybody's trauma history. They might know. And also, that when we're talking about early trauma, particularly, that can kind of like affect the vagus in terms of how it operates. So it can push, for example, people into a more of a dissociative state, a freeze kind of state, in what we call the old vagus or the dorsal vagus, for example. Hopefully I'll touch on that a bit later. I certainly talk about that in the course. I mentioned about nutrition affecting the vagus. There's been a lot of stuff around that, and the gut microbiome. Those of you who know about the gut and psychology syndrome diet or gut and physiology syndrome diet, GAPS diet, will know the person who developed that, Natasha Campbell McBride, really developed that in terms of her own children, one of whom I think was autistic, and developing, building up the good microbiome in the gut had this profound effect on her son's behavior. That's how she got interested in it in the first place. And there's more and more interesting research on that as well. But there are other things that affect the vagus, things like social isolation, and there are good reasons for that, because our nervous systems and our vagus is designed, or part of the newer part of our vagus is designed for social interaction. And I'll talk a little bit about the evolution of why that is so. But certainly we know that people who are isolated, who have less contact, are more prone to things like heart attacks and things like this. So that's a big thing, and social interaction in terms of the vagus as well. And then also anxiety has a big effect on the vagus, and as we said before, it helps control anxiety. And a lot of that is driven, or can be driven in people, by a lack of a sense of safety. And this is something that Stephen Porges talks a lot about, and is a big part of a lot of kind of recovery programs in terms of creating safety for people. Because the way he describes it is, once you have a feeling of safety, then people can relax, basically, is the bottom line. They can let go of their defensive mechanisms, which is your kind of more sympathetic part of your nervous system, which has to keep on alert, and you can settle in what Stephen Porges calls your new vagus. And when we do that, everything gets better, right? Your sleep gets better, your digestion gets better, etc., etc. But we need that safety. So in terms of any kind of social interactions, or particularly interactions with our clients, I stress over and over again that the number one thing is we need to create a sense of safety with our clients, because otherwise it's not really going to work very well. Whatever we do is not going to work very well. And this can be an issue with some people around safety who just don't feel safe at all. And sometimes that can come from early trauma, particularly kind of sexual trauma, but other things, and particularly stuff that's happened early on. This is from Bessel van der Kolk, whose famous book, The Body Keeps the Score, is a really wonderful one. But he says traumatized people chronically feel unsafe inside their bodies. The past is alive in the form of an interior discomfort. So their bodies are constantly bombarded by visceral warning signs. And in an attempt to control these processes, they often become expert at ignoring their gut feelings and numbing awareness of what is played out inside. They learn to hide from themselves. So this is to do with kind of, you could also call, sort of say, dissociation. And dissociation is one of the aspects of the very old vagus. Because again, it is a survival mechanism where we shut off because otherwise we get overwhelmed, or we can get overwhelmed. So when people have really chronic trauma, that's what tends to happen, kind of shut down. And it's interesting, this is a very physiological process. When we get traumatized, there's parts of our brain, particularly the insular cortex, which is all to do with our feeling sense of our body, begins to shut down. So we don't really feel anything. And we have a lot of clients like this who, might ask them, well, how do you feel? How does that feel? When I do this, how does that feel? And they say, well, I don't really know, because they can't really feel can't feel their bodies. Again, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just the nervous system trying to protect themselves. So I mentioned Stephen Porges, and he's really an absolute pioneer. I used to say that he should definitely get the Nobel Prize for his work because it's so revolutionary. But one of the things that he talks about in this article here, which came out a few years ago in one of our major newspapers here in the UK, was him explaining why it is that particularly when women are in danger, say, for example, in a rape situation or an assault situation, they often will go into a state where they seem to comply. And there's lots of reasons for this, and it's very, very misunderstood. So the way that he describes this is that in those extreme situations, which are very, very dangerous, the body goes into this old vagal state where it basically shuts down. And it's not like someone can voluntarily run away, because their whole system is telling them not to do that. It's safer to, sometimes called play dead. I don't really like that phrase because it's not playing around. It's a completely overwhelming thing that your nervous system does to protect yourself. So he's brought in cases trying to explain to judges, who are usually male, why it is that this particular woman didn't fight back. Why did you not run away? All those stupid questions. So this understanding of the nervous system really begins to explain that. And we can see this playing out also in animals. And I know people like Peter Levine have done, that's how they started, by looking at what happens when animals are traumatized. And one of the things that clearly happens when they're traumatized is they go into this kind of play dead situation, particularly if they feel they can't escape, where everything shuts down. The old vagus comes online and basically immobilizes them. And when they begin to come out of that, if whatever the danger is, the lion or whatever it is, gets distracted, then they will go through this process of kind of shaking, and where their sympathetic nervous system begins to come online again. And then they will go more into their social, where they'll begin to calm down. So you can see that kind of process playing out pretty clearly in animals. So just to say, there's a lot of books around this. This is one of the best ones that I know. It's a little bit old now, but it's by Stanley Rosenberg. I find this particular book very helpful because it's got a lot of information on it, which is very clear to understand. A lot of useful exercises in there. But I say there's a lot out. Some by Stephen Porges, some by Deb Dana, who's a wonderful clinician and works with Stephen a lot. There's been more recent ones by Deb Dana, and also a new one with Stephen Porges and his son Seth, Our Polyvagal World. But just to say that this book, particularly this newer one, doesn't really talk about some of the things that I've discussed already. So in terms of nerve entrapment, the gut, it's very much looking from the perspective of how can we create more safety in various environments, in the medical system, in the educational system, et cetera, et cetera. So, personally, I would recommend Stanley Rosenberg's book. And just very, very briefly, for those of you who are not familiar with this theory of Stephen Porges's, on the right there you have the old vagus. The old vagus is still running in us as the dorsal vagal nuclei in the brainstem, which originated, hundreds of thousands of years ago, when we were very primitive creatures and we basically just had a gut tube, a mouth and an anus, and we just digested stuff, and that was pretty much it, right? So that old vagus is still within us, and it's still primarily around digestion. So it's mostly subdiaphragmatic, and it's unmyelinated, it's quite slow. And then in evolution, the sympathetic nervous system came along, which enabled us to survive by running away or by fighting or, or catching food, that kind of thing, which we see in animals and we see in ourselves. And again, that system is running with it. It's still part of our autonomic nervous system, which has this sympathetic chain, which comes down all the way down the spine and meets just above the coccyx there. So that's still running in us. And then through evolution, the new vagus came on board, and that was again around survival, but it's to do with social interaction, because in order to survive, we needed to be able to communicate and cooperate with each other. So the new vagus, which is the ventral vagal nucleus, which is very close to the dorsal vagal nucleus and our brainstem there, is mostly to do with cooperation. So it really links in and works together with other key nerves like your trigeminal nerve, your facial nerve, your glossopharyngeal nerve, your accessory nerve, things to do with eye movement, neck movement, facial expression, the mouth, and the heart. And, so that is kind of like our default. This is where we should be living most of our lives. Now, tell that to a politician, most of the time, well, a lot of the time, people are not. They're more in their sympathetic. They're more kind of angry, taking sides, you're wrong, I'm right, blah, blah, blah. And, in terms of a hierarchy in our nervous systems, the way that Porges describes it, ideally we're in our new vagus, but if that doesn't work, we're in our sympathetic system, we get angry, trying to get our needs met through fighting or running away. And if that doesn't work, then we go into our old vagus. You see this happening a lot with babies. Babies naturally will be very, expressive. If they don't get what they want, they'll very quickly go into their sympathetic, getting very noisy. And if that goes on for a long time and they still don't get what they want, they will go into a kind of detached state, which is more the old vagus. And those babies, unfortunately, are often considered to be very contented because they don't really, express much. So anyway, there's ways of working with this, which I can't really go into now, using touch, using particular places that we work in the body, to get people, feeling safe in their bodies, and get the nervous system beginning to mobilize. And if they're stuck in one of these, if they're stuck in the old vagus, or they're stuck in their sympathetic system, we can begin to bring them out of that and back towards their new vagus. That's kind of like our plan of action and what we would do. And in terms of nerve entrapment, I'll just show you a couple of pictures here. There's quite a nice picture showing the base of the cranium here. That yellow thing, the vagus there, is coming out through the jugular foramen at the base of the cranium. And you can see how close it is to C1 and particularly C2. So again, that's a common area for nerve entrapment. And again, as manual therapists, we can certainly work with that as well. So I'll just do a few more minutes, and I'll open up for questions. So a word that Porges developed was this thing called neuroception, which is a sort of unconscious feeling in our bodies of feeling safe or not. So it's what he calls a neural assessment of safety, and we all do this all the time, probably on an unconscious level. We do even do it online, actually. But certainly, if you're coming into a room full of people, maybe your first day of a course or something like that, one of the things that we will do unconsciously is assess, is this a safe environment? Is the teacher safe? Are the other students safe? And we have various strategies for determining that, but it's happening in a very unconscious level. So we do that all the time. It's every kind of situation. It's different from perception. And when we feel safe, it then allows us to engage in social behaviors. Otherwise, we can't really do it. We're kind of stuck in our defensive mode. And animals do this. This is a picture of me working with my pig, giving my pig some manual therapy here. And so pigs and all animals actually have the same kind of thing. If they don't feel safe with you, they won't let you touch them. They won't let you anywhere near them. And same with putting our hands on clients. This is why safety is so important. This is me working with a mother and baby, and you can see there they feel very safe. And when they feel safe, we can begin to work. If they don't feel safe, we can't. So there's various ways that we can encourage this sense of safety. And I try and sort of mirror this in any kind of talks that I do or presentations that I do. So one thing is we can slow down our speech. We can use inflection in our voice, so the up and down. We can use hand gestures, facial expressions, smiling, good eye contact, mirroring, body language, and we can set up our space to promote safety, even in an online situation. And then with our clients, we can encourage things like breath. I was talking to a client just this afternoon about, really how she could use her breath to help her stress levels. So, that's very, very useful. We can even use that within a session. If we're doing some body work on someone, we can ask them to breathe through their nose into their tummy. You can do a nice long exhalation, for example. Touch, the kind of touch that we use, can also stimulate the vagus. But other things we can look at in terms of what they're doing. So social activities, particularly face-to-face activities, will help stimulate the vagus. And when, the vagus, there's lots of ways of measuring the vagus, but it's very, very clear that a healthy vagus, good vagal tone, they call it, is a very, very good predictor of general health. So the more we can do this, really, the better. There are some specific exercises that people like Rosenberg talk about, and there's certain physical activities that help stimulate. Things like music and the use of the voice, singing, for example, humming will help stimulate the vagus, and even generosity and compassion. There's been many studies on this done by Dr. Keltner and others in California around if you're generous and compassionate to others, that stimulates your own vagus. It's very, very good for you, which is great. And a few other things like eating, food. This is what we tend to do when we go out, for example, on a date. We'll go to a place which is beautiful, feels very safe. It usually involves, nice, cozy environment with food and drink and nice eye-to-eye contact and prosody, up inflections in the voice. All those things help stimulate our vagus. Meditation can be good, not for everybody, because for some people who are a bit traumatized, it can be difficult for them to sit still, as can mindfulness be quite challenging. But for many people, being still can be helpful in terms of stimulating the vagus. Imagination, humor, being in nature, curiosity is a very interesting one, and awe, being in the mountains, or curiosity about your condition. Why do you think you are feeling like this? What triggers you? What situations is this happening in? And all getting clients curious about what's going on. For those of you who know the HeartMath Institute, this is a very good way of getting clients more in touch with their vagus. It's a way of measuring heart rate variability, which is very, very simple to do as well. And then the breath, mostly diaphragm breathing, things like long exhalations, as we said, box breathing. If you've read James Nesbitt's book about breath, it's really, really excellent, and he talks a lot about that, so I'm not going to go into that. And this is Stanley Rosenberg's basic exercise, which I use a lot with clients, which just involves putting your hands, behind the head here, And when you do that, you are in contact with your brainstem. You're basically in contact with your dorsal vagal nucleus and your ventral vagal nucleus. And what you get them to do is just look to the right without turning their head. Now, they're going to do that until they have some sort of autonomic response, like a sigh or a deep breath or a yawn or something like that. And then you go back to the middle and you do the same thing to the left. Now, I often wondered about this little exercise. Why would it do that? And I think what it does, it kind of tricks the brain. Because, when we're in a sympathetic state, our focus is generally towards the front. And our nervous systems, our eyes are really designed much more for kind of scanning the horizon, you could say. This is why, sitting by the sea, for example, you got these big vistas will also stimulate our vagus. So by doing this little exercise, it's kind of tricking our mind into sorry, my camera zoomed in there for some reason, into thinking that we're like sitting by the sea, that we're scanning the horizon, we're not focusing in like our sympathetic nervous system does. And then there's other things like Wim Hofer's developed, like cold water on the back of the throat is a very good way of stimulating the vagus. Cold water swimming can be, and of course touch, all kinds of different kinds of touch. Particularly encouraging connection between the brainstem, the face, which is very much innervated by the vagus, the throat, the heart, and the abdomen. So you can do things like holding the back of the head, stroking the face, holding the back of the head and the heart, or the connection between the heart and the abdomen. All these kind of things are going to help. Okay, so I think we are going to stop now and open up for questions, if that's all right, Danny. Cool.
I am on. There we go. Thank you very much, John. Yeah, I see your camera is playing some automatic zoom in, zoom out, moving with your
camera. Yes, I'm sorry.
Yeah, well, it accentuated a couple of your demonstrations, which was cool. And I don't know if anyone else in the audience was, but as you were doing the hands behind the head exercise with looking to the right, looking to the left, I was following along with you.
Cool.
One of the questions that came in and around the, along these lines, and also one of the things I took note of to ask you was something, about the, like, do we know of any connections between, being what you called as in the, spending too much time in the old vagus or spending too much time in the sympathetic, state?
Yeah.
Connected to any, autoimmune issues, to any development of diseases in the body?
It's a really good question. I don't know if there's any, I'm sure there are actually in terms of studies of autoimmune conditions. Certainly being, I think we know a lot of people, and I know a lot of people and a lot of clients who might be stuck more in their sympathetic nervous system or their old vagus, more what we would call the old parasympathetic system. But so if we take the sympathetic system, people stuck in that will tend to affect their heart. It'll tend to affect their digestion, their sleep. It'll tend to make people more anxious. One of the questions that I often ask clients is about their sleep, but also, like, you could ask a question, well, do you find your mind is always active? And if they say yes, that's a sure sign that their sympathetic system is kind of stuck in a loop. To me, it's a bit like a record that's just going down, around and around. And some people, you get stuck in it and they can't get off it. And so one of the things I find in my work is that you are giving their body a different an opportunity for something different. So when you work with them and they sink down into a really profound state of relaxation and safety in their body, it tells the body, oh, it kind of reminds the body, oh, we don't have to keep doing this. We can drop down and we can relate to the world from a different place. It's very profound. So yes, there are long-term consequences of any of these. I mean, in terms of the old vagus, that tends to be people who are, I suppose, more shut down, who can't really feel. In that state, you don't really want to engage with life very much. There's a tendency not to want to engage with other people, so it would affect your social life and your relationships.
And when you were talking about that, I was like, you mentioned like animal examples, and I was picturing, animals freezing when they're being attacked by a lion or something like that. And I was also imagining, like in the human sense, I was imagining, depressed individuals. So is that also like depression is associated with being maybe stuck in the old vagus?
Yeah, very much so. Yes, I think depression is complicated, but you could say, for example, a stress thing where when we're stressed, most people tend to go into their sympathetic system. Whereas the old vagus, which is what we would call an old parasympathetic state, where we are dissociated, where, as I said, the insular cortex tends to kind of shut down, so we don't feel anything. And you could say in depression that's definitely happening. And I mean, I'm kind of familiar with that myself. I spent the first few years of my life kind of in that kind of state where I wasn't really aware that I was in that state, but I didn't really feel anything. And I also didn't really want to socially engage with anybody either. So that kind of isolation, it brings in that kind of sense of wanting to isolate. And I think this is also playing out with some clients. I mean, I've worked a lot with people with chronic fatigue syndromes, and we mentioned how, for example, their vagus might be affected by things like viruses. Obviously, we know that there's many things that might trigger someone with ME, chronic fatigue type symptoms. And sometimes it's a variety of things. So, for example, it can be nerve entrapment in the neck. It can be to do with viruses. It can be to do with maybe a trauma or a multitude of things, or a combination of things. But that can often tip them into this kind of more old vagal state, where it's very, very difficult to mobilize, where all your energy goes. I know there's issues with mitochondrial things as well, but it's like, it almost feels like the body is telling people not to mobilize, that it's not safe to mobilize. So it's not something that you can control. It's like, I know a lot of doctors in the old days, they said, well, you could just snap out of it, just go and do some more exercise. And it's not really like that, because the signals are, it's not safe. So one of the ways that we can work with those kind of people is, number one, create safety and work very, very, very slowly, because for those people it'll be very challenging to begin to come out of that, if that makes sense. Yeah, can you hear that?
Yeah, no, super interesting. It is, as I mentioned at the beginning, an ambiguous topic, and even the different methods that you mentioned to activate, and activating meaning shifting to the new vagus. Is that when we talk about activating the vagus nerve, is that what we're talking about, like slowing down the speech, like humming, like touch, for example? Is that what we're talking about?
Yeah, it's not a very good word, is it? I mean, because if your vagus nerve wasn't active, you'd be basically dead. So it's like, it's got to be active in one way or the other.
Yeah.
So yes, mostly when people talk about that, they're referring to the new vagus. Yes.
So I bring that up because even there it is ambiguous, because you said even something like meditation in one individual could could push them towards the new vagus, and in another individual it can push them the other way.
Yes.
And also like something like touch, in the right setting can
Yes.
push you to the new vagus, and in the wrong setting push you to the other side of the spectrum.
Absolutely.
Based on your experience, in body work and working with clients, like how did you integrate this? What is your method maybe recognizing when to implement some of these techniques and when to not, and in the benefits that you've seen of maybe incorporating some of these things into a body work session?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Danny. I mean, I think number one is, as I mentioned, about safety, and a lot of that is to do with relationship, because people feel safe or not in relationship. So at the very beginning of any therapeutic relationship, is very important to establish that. So there are various ways that I do that through the things we've talked about, through prosody and flexion, really caring for someone, but also trying to, for example, one thing I do is try and find a common area of experience. So that could have been you just been on holiday to Spain, or that you like, horse riding, or whatever it is. Because when you share a common experience, that immediately they begin to trust you, and then something shifts. And when they trust you, then they can feel safe. And the other thing is to be very aware of when you're working with someone. I know we talk about asking permission and all that kind of stuff is very important, but their bodies will tell you when they don't want something, when they don't want to be touched maybe at all, or in a particular place, or something like that. And this is kind of a bit more tricky, because someone who's been through trauma, so we get this a lot, say with someone who's been through a sexual trauma, early abuse, or something like that. But also it can also happen with say women who've been through a traumatic childbirth or something like this, where they're very used to saying yes, it's okay, when it's not. So their bodies are saying it's absolutely not okay, but they will say this is fine. So, but at the same time, if you say, okay, well, let's do some work here, and you'll feel their body freezing, then you've got to move on, or you've got to approach it in a different way. There's no point in staying somewhere. And that could be around the head, or the neck, or the feet, or the pelvis, wherever it is. So, so we're always kind of reading the body, and the autonomic nervous system will always show us. So there'll be changes. There'll be changes in the way they breathe. There'll be changes in the muscle tone and the skin, and the eyes. So we have to watch this, and we're always like monitoring it all the time. Yeah.
And even like safety doesn't have to be a like something like sexual abuse. It doesn't have to be something violent. It could be like people have trauma stored in them that in many, it's a very wide spectrum. And there's also like a saying where the worst thing that ever happened to you is the worst thing that ever happened to you. So does the vagus also, does it have that nuance and like relative connection to trauma, where in one individual, or like like a child, for example, if they don't get the cupcake, then they'll go into that old vagus state, versus an adult who's faced horrible things like the examples that you gave, get into an equivalent state?
Yes. I mean, it's a good question. I find this question very interesting. It's something I've thought about for an awful long time, because trauma really, and I see this a lot playing out with clients. You get two clients who've experienced pretty much exactly the same thing, and one person will be traumatized by it and the other person won't. So why is that? And I think it's very much around perception and context. So one person will perceive something as life-threatening, whereas another person won't. And there's all kinds of reasons for that. So it's very much to do with perception. And yes, then that sends signals to your autonomic nervous system about what do you do? Do you run away? Do you freeze? what do you do? And it's, some of these things I think originate very, very early, possibly even prenatally, certainly around birth and the first year of life, when we won't necessarily remember what happened. So, for example, I mean, to give you an example, someone who's separated at birth, doesn't happen quite so much these days, but for example, I was treating someone this week who, because they were very premature, the baby was separated out for a week or two, mother wasn't allowed to visit, you know, so that sets up a whole thing in someone's nervous system about the world, is that this world is not safe, or, you know, relationships are not safe, or, you know, whatever it is. So, and we won't know that when we have a client come in, we won't know necessarily that they were separated out at birth. They might not even know themselves. Their bodies will know, but they might not consciously know it, you know. So I don't know if the answer.
And yeah, there's a commentary about like a connection also to PTSD, which it is, right. It is trauma is in the acronym.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Is there a you know, when talking about the vagus nerve, is there an element there of, like, when we're looking at long-term maybe health, we're wanting to be in that new vagus state, is there an element of like fitness there, where the more, like, with the more you run, the better you become at running, and, you know, the longer you can run for? Is there some equivalence when it comes to connecting to that new vagus? Like, the more you are trying to get to that new vagus state, the easier it will be to stay in that state as a, you know, almost as a default, because all of us, you know, nowadays, you know, move from the phone to this, to that, to a webinar, to the next thing, you know, to errands. There's always something to do. So most of the time our default is not being in the new vagus state. And I almost, like, for myself, I almost need to approach it like a training regiment, because I feel like if I don't force it in there, like if you don't schedule, it's almost you know, the juxtaposition, but if you don't schedule time to meditate for 10 minutes, it probably won't happen, because we're in that sympathetic zone, you know, always doing stuff.
Yeah, no, I think it's very much like to do with repetition, habit, and you know, so you mentioned things like, you know, meditation, use of the breath, those things. Yeah, the more they become habitual, but, you know, you can also see it in the sense that other things get habitual. People going more into their who are more in their sympathetic system, who have to have constant external stimulation. Like you can often see them like moving, or their legs are moving, or having to have music on, or you know, constant stimulation. That's habit, really. In the same way that accessing the new vagus is a good habit, right? So yeah, the more we do it, I think initially it can be a little bit, yeah, perhaps, you know, you have to do it more consciously, and then it becomes more of a habitual.
Why is it so hard, do you think? I honestly think that it's harder to, you know, sometimes slow down your speech, or like disconnect, than to actually, you know, engage in maybe more difficult tasks, like going for a run, for example. It's easier for me to go for a 10-minute run than to meditate for 10 minutes.
Sure.
Is it, you know, and I think it's almost like if you you know, if you do bicep curls every day for 10 minutes, then you'll see your bicep growing. But it's difficult for someone maybe to gauge the benefit of activating that new vagus state, because, you know, because it's almost like maybe you don't see results until you need to, you know. Maybe it'll surprise you. Maybe you won't freeze in that moment of danger because you've been doing all this work. So it's almost like maybe prepping you for a moment that you might need your system to be there to support you.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, I think.
Sorry, I know it's ambiguous. So sorry, I'm challenging you here with questions that we don't necessarily have answers for.
Well, one of the things, I mean, when I started meditating when I was quite young, when I was about 20, and that was the thing that really helped me get in touch with my body. Actually, before that time, I wasn't really touched. And then after that, sort of more craniosacral work was a similar. I found it very meditative. It was very stilling. But it took a while because I didn't really feel safe in my body. And I think sometimes a lot of people don't want to feel their bodies because it doesn't feel particularly nice and it doesn't necessarily feel safe. So I think we have to do it slowly. We have to be very kind to ourselves. And, I tend to use quite simple things like feeling, getting people to feel sensation, something that's quite neutral. So if you feel a sensation of your feet on the ground or your buttocks on the chair or whatever it is, it's a fairly neutral thing. And you can kind of go in and out of that if it doesn't feel good. But one of the things it does is it also slows down your nervous system, because the sensations that you're getting from your feet or your arms or whatever you're focusing on is happening in present time. And that in itself will begin to access the new vagus. Because most of the time, when we're in a sympathetic state or parasympathetic state, we're not really present. Most of the time we're thinking about something. So we're thinking about something we've done in the past or what's going to happen in the future. That's a very active sympathetic state. But when you start to focus, this is the essence, I suppose, of mindfulness. When you start to focus on something, that brings, because the sensation is happening in present time, it slows your nervous system down. So that can be, a lot of the stuff is actually very, very simple, using your breath. It doesn't have to be complicated. Yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing, and thank you for the presentation. It really was awesome. As I mentioned in the beginning, we do have a vagus nerve course on the neilasher.com website. So everyone, please check it out. You should see the link above here on the screen. And also, we do have Bowen courses. We have a Bowen Basics course and a Bowen Therapy Advanced course on the website. And we should have a craniosacral therapy course being released in the very near future. So we have a few courses with John Wilks on the website. So thank you, everyone, for joining. Thank you for checking it. And thank you for taking the time to spend with us, whether it's morning in Saturday morning in New Zealand, or a evening or late evening in Europe, or a midday here in the United States. Thank you very, very much for joining. I don't know if you noticed on the comments, John, but we've had people join from really all over the United States, all over the world, all over Europe, UK as well. So it's pretty fun, pretty cool. Do not forget to register for the next webinar. You'll find the free live class page on our website, and you'll see the upcoming live classes and webinars that we'll be hosting. There'll be at least one every month. And please remember to follow us on social media and follow our podcast, and stay up to date with us by subscribing to the email newsletters. You will always get updates. You'll always get a lot of free, educational material, whether you're a practitioner, a manual therapist, massage therapist, personal trainer, strength and conditioning coach, or just someone who's super interested in this topic and exploring your own self. You will definitely see benefits from it. So John, I very much appreciate it. Thank you very, very much.
Yeah,
and it's always a pleasure. We did a couple of these together. We've done a few courses, and we did a couple podcast interviews. And I am always, I love hearing your perspective and the way you present things, and it always stimulates me to think about things from another perspective. And I think just listening to you speak, I think activates a little bit, or not activates, I'll stop using that word, but pushes us towards the new vagus, because you do speak in a way that's very soothing and very calming. So thank you. And I loved seeing that picture of you working with your pig. I did not know. See, there's always new things to learn about people. So do you have one pig or multiple?
I used to have a few, but I don't have any more, unfortunately. But that pig was my special pig, yeah.
He looked so cute. So thank you for sharing that. It's always fun to see. I wish you a lovely evening and a lovely weekend, everyone. And I even see here we have people from the Middle East, from Dubai, who joined us, Qatar. So really all over the world. And it is Friday the 13th, but I wish everyone hopefully a day of good luck and a lovely weekend. So thank you everyone for joining, and John, thank you again for presenting the topic.
Thanks everybody.
Have a great weekend. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.